Cool. I want to talk to you guys about native-like transitions React Router. So basically what I mean by this is, I'm sure you guys have all used React Router or something similar, and by default getting animations to work with it is a bit fiddly. So I just want to talk about how to get animations working in between these transitions between different pages. So I know this is probably a bit of a hard sell. Like routing components, probably one of the dullest things that you can talk about in a front-end talk. And animations, I know, are the type of thing that designers ask you to add in right at the end of all of your work, and your heart sinks a little bit. So talking about both of these things together, I know it seems like a bit of a hard sell, but I promise it's more interesting than it sounds. Unless you've heard it before, in which case, yeah, you really will feel like Patrick in this one. So with that, on we go. My name's Maxim Andrews, or not that, it's Stephen Cook. You can find me at Stephen Cook Dev on Twitter. Mentioned before, mention it again on Fido's hiring, but that's on the side. If there's any questions about the talk, feel free to tweet me. I'll respond to that, or just grab me afterwards. So this is basically, if any of you have worked with React Router before, it should be very familiar to you. It's a very basic just switch statement with some paths. If you don't know, I'll very quickly explain. If the path is box/A, it will show the A box. If it changes so that it's a box B, it will show the B box and the C box. This is how React Router works. This is fine. Obviously, there's no animations going on here. So what we'd want, ideally, is if we can have some magic extra thing where we just say it's a switch, but with a slide animation. And then with no extra work from us, when the route changes now, it changes to B, and you see it goes to the B box, but it does it with a slide transition. Similarly with C, and similarly, like if we go back a page, it just works. Ideally, that's what we're going for. Hopefully by the end of this talk, that should be something that everyone here can do. But first of all, let's just ask why. Like, why do we bother doing this? And there's two main reasons. One's cognitive load, and one's just the swish factor. So cognitive load is this idea in psychology that a human brain can only deal with so many things at once. And as soon as you start adding more and more things onto, like asking users to do so many things, eventually they start to get very confused. They'll still be able to do things, but they'll be more like things that they'd be able to do if they're focusing on it by itself, they might suddenly struggle to do. So we want to reduce that cognitive load. Animations can help with this. Animations are generally something that people understand. Like, people understand movement just inherently, like just biologically you understand it. We understand if something goes this way and then comes back, it's the same thing, or it's probably the same thing. So just to demonstrate that, this is a page that's I'm gonna go through some page transitions, and I just want you guys to shout out if you think we've gone forward a page or back a page. So start off on this, obviously the first one we've gone forwards. So next one, people just shout out if we've gone forward or backwards.
Back, forward, back.
Cool. So that was meant to be the easy one, that was forwards. If we go again, cool, so that one is forwards. It's very similar to the one that was just before, but it's actually a different number. Obviously this is a super contrived example, like no one has pages like this, or if you have pages like this, you seriously need to consider your UX. But the idea here is just that you can't, even if you could recognize, that if you could memorize these numbers, it's extra things that your brain's having to do. So if you're also trying to then ask that user to remember when they moved into their previous address or something, it's something that you're just adding extra things, and eventually the user's just going to say, no, I can't be bothered, I'm not doing this. So just to show like animation, how that can help. So you see here, we're on this page. I'm not even going to ask if people think we've gone forwards or backwards a page, because hopefully it's very clear that those two are forwards. Now it's going backwards now, because it's back 2 and then forwards 2. It's just clear from the way that the boxes are actually going which way you've gone. And the second thing that we care about doing this for is just the swish factor. And this is just the fact that it looks nice. It looks nice when some things zoom in or you have a bit of fade to them. And there's nothing wrong with this. As long as you don't break the bank, as long as you're not spending hours and hours trying to get these things to work, then it's just nice. Like, things that look nice are good. There's nothing wrong with that. As long as you don't overdo it. There's definitely really obtuse, like very long animations. These detract from the user flow. They're distracting. Generally, like, you want animations that people notice but don't really think about that much. If they really notice the animation, you've definitely done something wrong. So none of that. So what are the two issues here? So the first issue is that if we just want animations, that's fine, but animations don't have a concept of history. If you want to add an animation to something to get it to fade in, and then you want to say get that to fade out. So if you're doing this in CSS or even JavaScript, you don't have history as a inbuilt thing in that animation. Like there's no way to say do this when the route changes. You can manually do this, like you can hook into the history API yourself and do everything, and that's fine, it will work, but I mean, it's horrible code, right? You'll have React Router for most of your routing, and then for some of it, you're gonna have this weird custom history hooks that you're doing for your animation routes. It's not something we want. The second issue is that if we're then using React Router, so we start from that side, React Router instantly dismounts nodes when a route changes. It doesn't give you any hooks to say, wait until I finish an animation. It's as soon as the route changes, it's gone. That component that you had, it's no longer there. It's not being rendered. You can't animate it at all. So what's recommended in the React Router library? Like React Router library must recommend some solution, and they do. So what the React Router documentation, if you read through it, it will recommend that you use this library called Transition Group. So Transition Group's a really, really cool library. It basically, so this example is just going to go through and fade between two different things, still hooked in with React Router. So just to explain how this is all working. So you see the very top bit where we're saying route render location. That's just a really cheap way, basically, just to say what is the current location. That doesn't actually do anything otherwise. The next part that we have is the transition group. This is the thing that's actually going to manage all of our transitions. So if you don't worry too much about what it's doing specifically right now, I'll come back to it. The next thing we have is the CSS transition. And if you notice, we give it a key of the location key. So what actually happens here is when the location changes, we get an entirely different CSS transition block, which means that we get a different switch block as well, because switch is our child here. So actually in each transition here, we actually have two different components, two different switch blocks that are fading in between each other. And that's what CSS transition is doing. Here we're just applying a class name of fade, so that's literally just fading in between the two. So that's it, right? Like we're done. That's this gives us everything we want. It renders whole children. It animates in the new one and out the old one. So that's everything we've got. That's what we wanted. Except there's a problem. This is fine. Like if you're just trying to do animations like fading in and out, or some other very simple animations, like you're good. Like this will work. There are a couple of issues if you're trying to do something a bit more complicated. So the first one is that transition group tends to animate all of the components very dumbly. And what I mean by this is, and I can just quickly show you if I go between these pages, could you zoom out just once? Thanks. So if I go between these pages, you can see, and I've just got the components now. It's the same before, they're fading, but I just got them on top of each other rather than on top of each other. You can see if I go very quickly, you can see that actually there are all three of these things being rendered at the same time. The reason for this is that transition group has no idea that you're trying to do a route transition between two different pages. All it knows is a node entered, it needs to animate it in. A node leaves, it needs to animate it out. It has no idea anything on top of that, and you can't tell it anything on top of that. It's just not something that it supports. The next issue is that there's actually no link between the end of one transition and the start of another. And again, this is similar to the previous point. But if you want, say, to have your A box, you want that to animate out, and then once that's finished, then you want to start the animation for B. You can't do that. Transition group does not give you that API. Again, it's just very dumb. When something comes, it adds it. When something goes, it removes it. You can fake this. You can try and use a CSS transition to say, oh, like you just add a little bit of extra delay. And this will work, but again, there are two issues here. The first is that it's hacky code, right? Like you have this random delay that you're just adding into one animation, which would work. It's just not very nice, and it's not semantic. It's just an extra variable we've got somewhere, but it's fine. The other issue is that even though, so in that whole time when B is not visible, it's not visible, but it's only hidden on CSS. It is still there the whole time. It is on the DOM, it's there. And you can try your best to hook around this and make sure that it's on the DOM, but being hidden in the correct ways. So we actually tried Fido when we were trying to do something like this. We tried this originally and had a real nightmare just trying to get B to be hidden, but in such a way that it didn't interrupt A's animation out and then have a really janky entry when it came in. And then both of these things are just symptoms of the fact that customization is just hard. Transition group is designed for a very particular case, and it does that case really well. But that case isn't routing specifically, which is fine. It's not what the library is designed for. So what can we do to get around this then, if that transition group library doesn't do what we want? But we can actually just make our own. Like what transition group is doing, it's a really cool library, but what it's actually doing is something very simple. It's basically just when you tell it to stop rendering a node, it just ignores you and it just keeps rendering it. It stores that component in its state, so it can keep rendering after React basically told it to stop rendering it. And that's something that we can do ourselves. So this code, you don't need to read this, that's fine. But I'll quick, this is all the code that you need to basically get a component that will, when it exits, when something exits and something else comes in, it slides one out and slides the other one in. So I'll just now look at all that code in parts. So the first part of it is render function. So what the render function is doing is, it has this slider component. This slider component, I'm not going to show the source for it. It's really small. This is all online if anyone does want to take a look. Basically, like all it needs is you pass it a position. So that position is going to be something like center or from left. And if you say from left, it will basically animate it so that it comes in from the left and then goes to the center. Or you can say to right, which means it starts from the center and goes out to the right. It also has this thing called animation callback, which just means when you do that, once that's finished, just call that function. And that's just using a very simple event listener in JavaScript. And then the only other thing that see in the actual render, where normally you'd say this.props.children, what we're instead saying is this.state.previous child or the current child. So here, and we'll get to this later, but we're storing both of our children in state so that we can say, even though React's telling us that our new child is this thing, we're going to ignore it. We're going to keep rendering the old one until we're done. The next thing is the component did update function. So every time this.props.children does change, we want this to call. So this first bit where it's comparing IDs, that's basically just working out, is this child the same child as before, or is it a different page? And as soon as it's a different page, we're going to trigger this. We're going to say set state, set it so that the position it's going to left. So we're going to start moving the old child out. We're also going to say set the state so that our current child is the new page and our previous child is the page that we just were on. So we're going to keep rendering the old one even though this.props.children is different, and we're just rendering it over to the left. And then we're going to say on animation callback, so once that's done, we're going to call swap children. Once we do call swap children, so once we get to there, what we're going to do is then say, okay, clear the previous child. So we'll suddenly start rendering the current child, the new one, and it's going to be from right. So it will jump from over here and it will suddenly jump to the right-hand side and start coming into the center. And then as soon as that's done, like we don't need to listen to the callback at all. Like that's it. The animation is finished. That's everything we care about. And that all just makes up all of that code. And that's everything that we need here. There's one extra helper function actually as well that we can add in, which is basically just a higher order component. So this is a component that we can say animate a switch, and it will make us a new switch component. So we could pass in the React router switch component, and it will make us a new one that just uses our animator component. So you see here we're saying at the bottom we're saying animate switch with the React router switch and our slide out function that we just made. And what it's doing, you see the root render location. That's the thing I talked about before, where it literally just gets us hold of the location. And then it does exactly the same as the transition group method, the transition group solution, where it just says make two different switch blocks and use the animator to actually fade them in and out. So I'm going to very quickly go off the stage to the laptop and I can show you guys this working. Cool, so if I just do, can everyone see that at the back? Yep, cool. So this code is very simple. It's just a normal switch component with a couple of roots. When the page changes, it changes just from these different animals. So what we want is to be able to take that code that we just saw, and if we just copy all of that code, we want, ideally, this is just going to paste in, and we just need to change one function. So we have our animate switch, we're saying slide out. So we had this animate switch, and then we're creating the switch with slide. So now if we just change this from switch to switch with slide, and if we do that, just close it up as well. So if everyone's prayed to the demo gods, this now should just work. Cool, so you see it's now switching with slide. And we can very quickly as well just show you. So if we get rid of this overflow hidden, and if we as well just change our slider animation, so currently the transition takes 0.2 seconds, we just change that to 20, or actually if we just make it 10. Cool, so now you should be able to see what happens. So here you see with moving over to the left, we call the swap children function at this point because the animation's finished, and then it changes, clears the previous rendering, comes in and finishes. So if you remember, that was everything that we were aiming to get, right? Like we were trying to get this switch component that is just this regular switch component, A, B, and C, and we just need to change it to switch with slide, and then we get A, B, and C. There's one small thing I missed out. I didn't tell you how to get backwards animations, but it's actually really simple. It's just working out basically if you just specify an order of routes and then just do a different animation. I say all of this code's online. If anyone wants to look at it, I'll tweet about it just after this. But I'm sure you can all work it out. It's quite a simple just if statement in some of that code that we had. But yeah, go forth and animate. That should hopefully be, everyone should hopefully be more knowledgeable in how to do this sort of thing, and hopefully no one cries next time you get asked to add an animation into a page transition. So yeah, again, you can find me at StephenCookDev on Twitter. Thanks everyone for listening.